It was a quiet evening when Rebecca's world was turned upside down. A knock at her door led to an unexpected encounter with the police, but what seemed like a routine visit quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. What did they want from her, and why were they so aggressive? As the night unfolds, Rebecca finds herself caught in a web of mystery, and the truth behind their visit will leave you speechless. Stay with us, because what happens next, no one could have predicted. But first, if you're enjoying our stories and want to support the channel, hitting that like button really helps us out and means a lot. You'd be doing us a huge favor. Clara Thompson, a beloved elementary school teacher, had always prided herself on being an advocate for her students and an anchor in her community. Her world revolved around helping young minds grow, offering guidance and kindness to everyone she met. But little did she know, one routine day would throw her life into complete disarray, shaking the very foundation of her beliefs in justice, fairness, and humanity. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the day started just like any other. The final school bell had rung, and Clara waved goodbye to her students, smiling as they eagerly scampered out into the schoolyard. She gathered her teaching materials, making a mental note to prepare for the next day's lessons before locking up her classroom and heading towards her car. The vibrant colors of fall leaves surrounded her, but something unsettling stirred in the air. As she crossed the parking lot, Clara noticed a police cruiser parked nearby. At first, she thought nothing of it. After all, officers often patrolled the area to ensure the students' safety. But when the cruiser began to inch closer, Clara felt a pang of unease. She ignored the feeling and continued walking, her keys jingling in her hand. But the moment she heard the car doors slam shut, her heart skipped a beat. "Ma'am, could you stop for a moment?" a deep voice commanded. Clara turned to see two officers approaching her, one tall and burly, the other shorter but with a piercing stare that made her skin crawl. Despite their authoritative stance, Clara greeted them politely. "Good afternoon, officers. Is there something I can help you with?" The taller officer wasted no time, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper with a photograph on it. "You matched the description of a suspect involved in a robbery earlier today," he said, his tone clipped and accusatory. Clara blinked, confusion washing over her. A robbery? She had spent the entire day teaching, not leaving the school grounds even once. This had to be a mistake. "I think there's been some confusion," Clara replied carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have been here all day teaching. There are cameras in the school and plenty of witnesses. I'm a teacher here. You can verify that with the principal." But the officers seemed uninterested in her explanation. The shorter one, clearly less patient, stepped forward and grabbed Clara's arm with a firm grip. "We're taking you in for questioning. You can explain yourself at the station," he growled. Clara's heart pounded as she instinctively tried to pull away. "Please! I didn't do anything wrong! There must be some mistake!" she cried, her voice rising in panic. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers moved swiftly, forcing her arms behind her back and clamping cold, unforgiving handcuffs around her wrists. Pain shot through Clara's shoulders as she was pushed against the side of the police car. Her chest tightened with fear and humiliation. How had things escalated so quickly? She wasn't resisting, but the officers acted as if she were a hardened criminal, treating her roughly as they shoved her into the back of the cruiser. From across the street, one of Clara's neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Ramirez, witnessed the entire scene unfold. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and began recording, her heart heavy as she watched her kind-hearted neighbor being manhandled by the police. She had known Clara for years and couldn't fathom how this could be happening. Inside the car, Clara's mind raced. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about her students. What would they think when they found out? Her heart ached as she imagined the confusion and disappointment on their faces. Clara had always prided herself on being a role model, someone they could look up to, and now she was being taken away in handcuffs. The shame was almost too much to bear. The ride to the station felt like a lifetime. Clara stared out the window, numb with disbelief, as familiar streets passed by in a blur. She prayed that someone, anyone, would realize the mistake and set things right. But deep down, a gnawing fear took hold. She had heard stories like this before, stories where justice was far from guaranteed. Would anyone believe her? When they arrived at the police station, Clara was yanked from the car and escorted through a maze of fluorescent-lit hallways, each step filling her with dread. The officers didn't speak to her except to bark orders, and she was too shocked to protest. They led her to a small interrogation room, cold and barren, except for a metal table and 2 chairs. She was pushed down into one of the chairs as the door slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Time dragged on in unbearable silence. Every second felt like an eternity as Clara's mind raced. What had she done to deserve this? She wasn't a criminal, she was a teacher, a person who had dedicated her life to helping others. But here she was, locked in a room, being treated like a suspect in a crime she knew nothing about. Desperation clawed at her as she replayed the events over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it all. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door opened and 2 officers entered, neither of them the ones who had arrested her. One of them carried a file, while the other remained stoic, his face expressionless. They sat down across from Clara, not offering her any kind words or reassurances. "Clara Thompson," the officer with the file said, glancing down at his papers, "you're being held in connection with a robbery that occurred earlier today. Witnesses identified you as being at the scene." Clara's jaw dropped. "But that's impossible! I was at school all day. I didn't leave. There are cameras and witnesses who can confirm that. Please, you have to check." "We'll investigate that," the other officer cut in, his tone cold. "But for now, you're going to stay here until we sort things out." Clara felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. They weren't listening. No matter how many times she explained herself, they had already made up their minds. As they left the room, Clara slumped in her chair, tears of frustration and fear stinging her eyes. What more could she do? Back outside the police station, word of Clara's arrest had spread quickly. Mrs. Ramirez had posted the video she had taken online, and it didn't take long for it to go viral. The video, showing Clara being forcefully detained despite her protests of innocence, struck a chord with many who watched it. Comments poured in, demanding justice for Clara and questioning the motives of the officers involved. Within hours, a small crowd had gathered outside the station, holding signs and chanting for Clara's release. Friends, family, and community members rallied around her, knowing that this was not just a fight for one woman's freedom, but a stand against the systemic injustices they had seen too many times before. Clara Thompson had never imagined that her life would take such a dark and surreal turn. She was a beloved teacher, admired by her students and respected by her colleagues. Her days were filled with lesson plans, school events, and the joy of watching young minds grow. But now she found herself trapped in a nightmare that seemed too absurd to be real. The arrest, the accusations, the cold stares from officers who refused to listen, none of it made sense. And yet here she was, sitting in a holding cell, her wrists raw from the handcuffs, her heart heavy with fear and confusion. As Clara sat on the hard bench in the holding cell, the coldness of the room seemed to seep into her bones. She had spent what felt like an eternity in that small, windowless space, the walls closing in on her as the hours dragged by. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day over and over, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled so far out of control. How had it come to this? She could still feel the rough grip of the officer's hand on her arm, the way they had shoved her into the back of the police car without so much as an explanation. She had tried to explain, tried to reason with them, but they hadn't listened. They had already made up their minds, and nothing she said seemed to matter. The weight of the injustice pressed down on her chest like a boulder. She had always believed in the system, believed that if you did the right thing, followed the rules, and treated others with kindness, you would be treated fairly in return. But now, sitting in that cold cell, Clara realized that the world wasn't always fair. Sometimes it was downright cruel. Her thoughts drifted to her students. What would they think when they found out what had happened? Would they understand that she was innocent, or would the accusations taint their perception of her? Clara had worked so hard to be a positive role model for those children, and the thought of them seeing her as anything less than that was unbearable. Outside the precinct, the crowd of protesters continued to grow. News of Clara's arrest had spread like wildfire, and the community had rallied around her. People who knew her, parents of her students, neighbors, colleagues, had shown up in force, holding signs and chanting for her release. They knew Clara wasn't capable of the crime she had been accused of, and they were determined to see justice done. Among the protesters was Clara's younger sister, Danielle. She had been there since the moment she found out what had happened, tirelessly fighting for her sister's freedom. She'd shown the video that Mrs. Ramirez had taken to anyone who would watch, sharing it across social media, and making sure that Clara's story was heard. The video, which showed Clara being wrongfully arrested and mistreated by the officers, had struck a nerve with people far and wide. Danielle had always looked up to her big sister. Clara had been the responsible one, the one who had always been there to help her with her homework, to comfort her when she was sad, to give her advice when life got tough. And now, seeing Clara in such a vulnerable position, Danielle felt a fierce determination to do whatever it took to make things right. She paced back and forth outside the station, clutching her phone in her hand, watching as more people joined the protest. The air was thick with tension, and Danielle could feel the anger and frustration building in the crowd. People were fed up with the police, with the system, with the constant injustices that seemed to plague their community. "We won't leave until she's free!" Danielle shouted, her voice hoarse from hours of chanting. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices echoing off the brick walls of the precinct. Inside, Clara could faintly hear the noise from outside. It was muffled, but the sound of the chants gave her a small glimmer of hope. She wasn't forgotten. People were fighting for her. But as much as she wanted to believe that everything would be okay, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. She had seen too many stories like this before, stories where innocent people were swept up by the system, chewed up, and spit out with their lives forever changed. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. She had to stay calm, had to stay strong, but it was hard, so hard, when everything felt so hopeless. Suddenly, the door to the holding cell swung open, and Clara's heart leaped into her throat. For a moment, she thought that maybe, just maybe, they were finally going to let her go. But when she saw the cold, detached expression on the officer's face, her hope quickly faded. "Your sister's been causing a scene outside," the officer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's trying to get people riled up, but it's not going to work. You're not going anywhere." Clara felt her stomach drop. She had hoped that the protests might make a difference, that the public pressure would force the police to admit their mistake. But it seemed like the officers were digging in their heels, refusing to back down. "Please," Clara said, her voice cracking. "I didn't do anything wrong. You have to believe me. I was at the school all day. There are cameras. There are witnesses. You can check." The officer cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Save it for the court," he said coldly. "You're not getting out of here until we say so." With that, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Clara's legs felt weak, and she sank down onto the bench, burying her face in her hands. How could this be happening? How could they just ignore the truth like this? Hours passed, though it felt like days, and Clara's sense of time became distorted in the cold, windowless cell. She had no way of knowing what was happening outside, no way of knowing if anyone was still fighting for her. The isolation was suffocating, and the weight of the injustice bore down on her like a heavy cloak. Just as Clara thought she couldn't take much more, the door to the cell opened again. This time, it was her lawyer, Mr. Hawkins, and Clara felt a surge of relief at the sight of his calm, steady presence. He was a tall man with graying hair and a kind face that exuded confidence. "Clara," he said softly, sitting down beside her, "we're going to get through this. I promise you that." Clara's voice wavered as she spoke. "They won't listen to me, Mr. Hawkins. They don't care about the truth. What if they—" Mr. Hawkins held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "Listen to me. The evidence is on our side. We have witnesses, we have security footage, and we have that video from Mrs. Ramirez. They can't ignore it forever. The system might be slow and it might be flawed, but we will get you out of here." Clara nodded, though her heart still felt heavy with doubt. But what if they find a way to twist things? What if— "They won't," Mr. Hawkins said firmly. "They can't. The truth is too strong in this case. You were nowhere near that robbery, and we can prove it. You just need to hold on a little longer. Let me do my job, and we'll get you out of this." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would turn out okay after all. Over the next few days, the pressure on the police department continued to mount. The video of Clara's wrongful arrest had gone viral, drawing attention from media outlets across the country. News vans lined the street outside the station, and reporters clamored for interviews with anyone connected to the case. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had become tense. Officers whispered to one another in hushed tones, casting furtive glances at Chief Morrison, who had grown increasingly irritable as the situation spiraled out of control. The chief was a no-nonsense man, known for his tough stance on crime, but even he couldn't ignore the growing storm outside. "What's the status on the case?" Morrison barked at his subordinates during an emergency meeting. "Why haven't we wrapped this up yet?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir, there's evidence coming to light that might complicate things," one of the detectives said, his voice hesitant. "The security footage from the school. It's pretty clear that Clara Thompson wasn't involved in the robbery. And that video from the arrest. It's making us look bad. People are talking about police misconduct." Morrison's face darkened. "I don't care about optics," he snapped. "I care about results. We can't just back down now. If we do, it'll look like we're weak. We need to find a way to salvage this." The officers looked at one another, unsure of how to proceed. The case against Clara was crumbling, and they all knew it. But Chief Morrison wasn't the kind of man who admitted defeat easily. As the meeting adjourned, Morrison stormed back to his office, slamming the door behind him. He knew that his reputation was on the line, and he wasn't about to let one case bring him down. But deep down, a nagging doubt gnawed at him. Had they really made a mistake? Was Clara Thompson truly innocent? The day of Clara's court appearance finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension. The public gallery was packed with supporters, many of whom had been part of the protests outside the police station. Clara's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and anxiety. As Clara was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The weight of the past few days hung heavily on her shoulders, and she struggled to keep her composure. Her lawyer, Mr. Hawkins, walked beside her, offering quiet words of reassurance. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case, though it was clear that they were grasping at straws. Their witnesses gave inconsistent testimonies, and their evidence was flimsy at best. It quickly became apparent to everyone in the courtroom that the charges against Clara were baseless. When it was Mr. Hawkins' turn to present the defense, he did so with the calm, methodical precision of a seasoned lawyer. He called several witnesses to the stand, colleagues, students, and parents who all testified to Clara's character and whereabouts on the day of the robbery. He presented the security footage from the school, which clearly showed Clara teaching in her classroom at the exact time the robbery took place. But the most damning piece of evidence came when Mr. Hawkins played the video that Mrs. Ramirez had taken. As the footage rolled, showing Clara's arrest in all its brutal detail, the courtroom fell silent. The officers' rough treatment of Clara, their refusal to listen to her pleas, the way they had manhandled her, all of it was on display for the jury to see. When the video ended, Mr. Hawkins turned to the jury, his voice calm but firm. "This is not the behavior of officers upholding justice," he said. "This is the behavior of officers who have already made up their minds. They didn't arrest Clara Thompson because she was guilty. They arrested her because it was convenient, and that is not justice." The jury deliberated for only an hour before returning with their verdict. "We find the defendant, Clara Thompson, not guilty on all charges." The words rang through the courtroom, and Clara felt a rush of relief so powerful that her knees nearly gave out. She had won. The truth had finally prevailed. But even as the cheers erupted around her, Clara knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still so many others like her, people who had been wrongfully accused, who had been swept up by a system that didn't care about the truth. And Clara knew that she couldn't just walk away now. As she left the courthouse that day, Clara made a vow. She would continue fighting, not just for herself, but for all those who needed a voice. Because justice wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about changing the system. And with her community by her side, Clara knew that they could make that change, one step at a time. In the weeks and months that followed the trial, Clara's case became a rallying cry for reform. Community leaders and activists used her story as an example of the systemic injustices that plagued their town and beyond. Clara herself became a reluctant spokesperson for the movement, speaking at rallies and town hall meetings, sharing her experience with anyone who would listen. At first, it was overwhelming. Clara had never sought the spotlight, had never imagined that her life would become the center of a fight for justice. But as she stood in front of crowds, as she listened to the stories of others who had been wrongfully accused, she realized how important her voice had become. People needed to hear her story. They needed to know that change was possible, that injustice could be fought, and Clara was determined to be a part of that fight. But it wasn't easy. The police department had tried to sweep the whole ordeal under the rug, but the public outcry had been too loud to ignore. Chief Morrison had faced increasing scrutiny, and an internal investigation had been launched into his handling of Clara's arrest. Some officers had been placed on leave, and there were rumors that Morrison himself might be forced to step down. But even as the department faced mounting pressure, there were still those who refused to admit that they had done anything wrong. Some of the officers involved in Clara's arrest remained defiant, insisting that they had followed procedure, that they had done their jobs. Clara knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight. The system was too deeply ingrained, too resistant to reform. But she also knew that the cracks were starting to show. People were paying attention.